Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Jennifer Roback Morse, founder and president of the Ruth Institute. I just finished a dynamite interview with Emma Waters of the Heritage Foundation, talking about not just infertility, not just IVF, but talking about restorative reproductive medicine, the humane alternative to IVF. You got to see this show. If you've got any questions, this is the place to get the answers you need. We're going to have show notes that go down to your arm. We got so much stuff to talk about. We couldn't get it all in there, but you're going to love this show. So please tune in. Emma Waters, welcome to the Dr. J Show.
Thanks so much for having me today.
Mrs. Waters, you've become the go-to girl for all kinds of things at the Heritage Foundation having to do with third-party reproduction, donor conception, IVF, and most importantly, alternatives, humane and ethical alternatives to some of those things. And so I want to give you a chance to just walk us through all of that. We're going to go through all that, but I want to start with the fact that you had an interview with the New York Times recently that was really a masterclass in how the global elites run interference for the whole sexual revolution. What do you think she was trying to hide in the way that she was asking you questions, the things she asked, the things she didn't ask? Tell us what that interview was all about.
Yes. And so this was actually the third time that the New York Times has profiled the work that I'm doing on restorative reproductive medicine and root cause care for infertility in the last year and a half. So it's been quite a bit in a short amount of time. But this was the first time that we had gone on the record and sat down with the reporter. We actually had her come stay at our house for a day to really get a feel for our family life and culture. And so it was both about me as a mom and my husband and our family, and also about the policy work that I'm doing with the Heritage Foundation. But I think there were a couple of things that really stood out to me. The first is that the reporter herself was actually in her 70s. So she had been.
I'm sorry?
The reporter was 70 years old. Or in her 70s. And so
Oh,
she'd actually been working at the New York Times since the year I was born. And so she had a very long view of these issues in a way that most reporters that I talked to who were in their 20s or 30s, it's a generational difference. And so what I found really interesting is when she was asking me cultural questions, for example, her touch point was quite literally the sexual revolution and Betty Friedan. Like that's who she was asking about. It wasn't third wave feminism or post 2010 girl boss feminism as much as it was really this 1960s and 70s and 80s iteration of the sexual movement, which was really interesting because that forced me to think, okay, how am I communicating my ideas to someone who has a very different cultural touch point than what I have, being born and raised sort of in the 2000s as I have been. And so there definitely was this skepticism of how can you say that you're a conservative who supports the family, but clearly you're doing a lot of work these days and you seem to be succeeding pretty well in the work that you're doing. And it was this funny moment where reading the article, it really struck me that she just didn't know what to do with me or other conservative women who were successful in the endeavors that they've participated in, and yet we're unabashedly family first, pro family. We love babies. We want to have lots of babies as the Lord will give us, and that's actually the number one priority. And so while I enjoy the work that I get to do, my career is not the most important thing in my life. It's not what I'm building my entire family and home around. And so that seems to just strike a lot of people, particularly on the left, is very odd. Like they don't know what to do with it. Yeah.
right, right, right. And you know what's funny is that I'm in my 70s too, and I lived that from the opposite end. You know, there are a lot of women of my generation who are still stuck back there, but there are an awful lot of us. And they're followers of the Ruth Institute who are like, oh my gosh, I tried this for like 10 years and like, no, you know, or I figured out too late, or, you know, there's a lot of, like you say, there's a different vantage point from seeing all of that. And so I'm so excited that there are young ladies like you. You don't have to go through all the angst that we went through. Hopefully our example maybe did something constructive, right? To be able to say we tried this and it was a complete bust. But I was struck by the fact that she was more interested in your culture than in it's almost like when you start talking about alternatives to IVF, like that's like she couldn't quite process that
Right.
you were serious. So tell people a little
Yeah.
bit about that, because that's got to be a barrier for a lot of people.
It is. And it's a very understandable barrier because for so many decades, IVF was the one size fits all solution for infertility that academia, politics, modern culture, OBGYNs, they were all steeped in this way of thinking of if you're dealing with infertility, then IVF is the solution. And so anytime
Right.
you push back on that and say, well, actually, maybe there's a different way to go about this, maybe the high cost of IVF, the adverse health outcomes for the mother and the baby, all of the moral and ethical problems in IVF with the creation, selection, and destruction of human life, maybe there's a better way we should think about this. And so one of the things that she, and I think a number of people really wrestle with, is twofold. The first is that why do we need an alternative to IVF if IVF is the thing that treats infertility? And the second is, well, aren't you just delaying necessary care by telling people to do other treatments before IVF? And I think,
Oh,
yes,
I can't even stand it. Oh my God. After all these years,
yes,
after
no, I
all
know.
these years, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Ruthie's, forgive me. But, honestly, this makes me crazy because these are the same people who have been telling people don't start your family until you've made partner in the law firm and paid off all your school debt. And now they're yelling at you because you're saying get some checkups before you go. You had a great phrase, Emma. I'm going to put these words in your mouth, but you can take them back if you want. But you said something like, you tell us to delay, 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 and now you're going to sell me a $30,000 workaround for what should have worked in the first place.
Yeah, exactly. We in many cases, and this is something she quoted at the beginning of the article, was that Emma Waters is encouraging women to get married and have babies earlier in life, and a lot of people were clutching their pearls and very upset by this. But the reality is, as you're pointing out, it's easier if you prioritize it sooner. And this isn't an
Right.
all or nothing, we want women to
Right.
not get
Right.
educated and not get jobs or do meaningful things. Like, that's a very ridiculous, just straw man's argument to respond with.
Yes.
But I think we should also just be honest about what we're prioritizing and what naturally works well with the female body and with male, even with male factor fertility and infertility. Yeah. And I think a lot of it comes down to a misconception about what infertility is. Because if you think that
Yes.
infertility is just a disease, then IVF is the procedure, quote unquote, that treats the disease. But in reality, infertility is actually a symptom of underlying reproductive health problems in the man and or woman's body. And
Right.
based on all the studies that have been done, infertility is actually shared equally between men and women. So it's not just, quote, a women's issue. It's actually something that both partners, statistically speaking, will equally struggle with. And when there is a diagnosis of infertility, research has also shown that there tends to be four or more underlying conditions at play, which means that IVF is like a blunt tool attempting to bypass the body, bypass those underlying conditions, and just try to create a baby, a human embryo in a lab, and reinsert it in the woman's body in hopes that that works. But IVF does nothing to treat the underlying conditions that have
Yes.
caused infertility in the first place. And so the result is that not only do the IVF treatments leave women less healthy than they were before, not only do they result in far higher rates of adverse outcomes for the children that are born, but you've done nothing to improve the health of that woman or of the man. And in
Right.
cases where there's recurrent miscarriages, this is where I think it's particularly heartbreaking because in the United States, we actually, OBGYNs don't take miscarriage seriously until you've had three miscarriages, which is
What?
heartbreaking. They will
Oh
not do
my
full
gosh.
workups. And so, actually, one doctor has said that if they counted miscarriage as a cause of death, it would be one of the leading causes of death in the United States because our miscarriage rates are so high. And so I've talked to women who said I was struggling with recurrent miscarriages. My OBGYN said I needed to do IVF. But the problem was not her conceiving of the child. Her problem was her body's ability to sustain the pregnancy.
Yeah.
What
Yeah.
happens in
Oh.
IVF is you create more embryos, but then she miscarried all of the embryos she created
Oh.
in IVF.
Oh.
No
Oh.
one actually treated and improved her body's ability to be a mother. And so it's cases like that where I'm like, it's so frustrating because you're actually denying good men and women's health care to these couples struggling with infertility, because IVF is doing nothing to actually improve the causes of that infertility in the first place.
So let's walk through restorative reproductive medicine. I want you to tell people what it is. You've given people a little bit of a hint. And by the way, it's funny that you mentioned that because I interviewed Stacy Transakos. Do you know Stacy? She's got a book called Why IVF is Not the Way, and she herself had had multiple miscarriages, right? And we've also interviewed Dr. George Delgado, who is the person who figured out the abortion pill reversal protocol, which has to do with using the medication that helps women deal with miscarriage, women who are having trouble holding on to the baby, and so all of that information is available to you all, Ruthie's. You can look. We'll put that in the show notes, so you can find the interview with Dr. Stacy. I'll just call her Dr. Stacy and Dr. Delgado. But now, Emma, I want you to walk us through, what do you mean by restorative reproductive medicine? It sounds like it covers a bunch of things. And just kind of walk us through what it means and how it works.
Yes. So restorative reproductive medicine is an umbrella term that refers to medical specialties that prioritize root cause care in the treatment of infertility. So the primary medical approaches that restorative reproductive medicine accounts for are natural procreative technology, which has been around since the 1970s and 80s. FEM, or female education and medical management, which is a hormone based restorative care model that's very popular in the United States. And then neofertility. Neofertility is a more recent development based from doctors who were trained in natural procreative technology, but now neofertility itself actually focuses on autoimmune disease factors as one of the key unique factors for the kinds of infertility it's treating. And so those are the three big bucket medical approaches that are doing this root cause care for infertility. Though there are clinics across the US or doctors across the US that maybe don't claim one of those, but have been trained in one of those fields and now just offer restorative care for infertility and reproductive health conditions like endometriosis, PMOS, hormonal imbalances, male factor infertility. The list goes on and on. But the key is that with restorative reproductive medicine doctors, they're one, relying on cycle tracking as one of the key diagnostic tools, particularly for female infertility. And so they're working very closely to actually train women on how to track their cycle, their symptoms from ovulation, menstrual cycle to all the phases to get a full picture of her health. And what's interesting is
Yes.
ACOG, one of the largest fertility medical organizations, has actually said that the female cycle is the fifth vital sign for women's health. It's not just your blood pressure, your heart rate, all of these others. It's your cycle, which tells you so much about your overall health and ability to conceive or why you're not conceiving. And that's part of the cornerstone of restorative reproductive medicine, is actually taking the woman's body seriously and then doing a deep dive to truly diagnose what is causing the infertility and restore it. So they're not just
Right.
bypassing those features for IVF, but they're actually saying, no, if infertility is a symptom, if you heal the underlying causes, then you have enabled someone to naturally conceive and bear children in a way that's actually far more life affirming, innovative, and, well, restorative.
Right, right. And I want to take a moment. I want to take a moment to give a shout out to our friends at Natural Womanhood, who have all kinds of programs, particularly for moms to talk to their daughters about how to start charting your cycle so that you know your body. And you would think that those of us from the hippie generation would have been into knowing our body and whatnot, but no, we bypassed all that and went for the medical stuff. So it's really heartening to see this attention being paid to this aspect of the fertility issue. Let me ask you this: are you in a position to speak with doctors, Emma? Do you ever get calls from doctors like, "How do I get involved in this? How do I get trained in it?" and stuff like that? Can you give us just a little bit of information about that? Is now a good time to do that, or should we do that later in the show? What do you
This is
think?
great. Yeah, well, and I think this is part of what is so what I've enjoyed so much about my role, because obviously my primary orientation is policy analyst, policy expert. We do a lot of education. We do a lot on the front of trying to help everyday Americans understand this issue, as well as lawmakers understand the issue and what they can practically do in the policy world. But of course, I'm not a medical professional, but we get to work very closely with a lot of really smart people who are leading on the medical side of things, whether it's natural womanhood or facts about fertility or natural procreative technology, and the list goes on and on and on. And so I have been able to situate myself at the nexus of so many of these conversations where I'm certainly not who they're calling when they need medical advice, obviously, but when they're asking, how do we get involved? How do we increase awareness? What advocacy opportunities are there? We're able then to connect them and say, well, this is a really big need that we're seeing, or it would be really great if you can go and brief this congressman from the medical side of things about this issue, and we'll help them understand the policy opportunities that come with this issue. And so we're certainly playing a bit of a coalitional connection role, if you will, of getting all of these different parties together, and likewise having patient stories, patient advocacy that sometimes comes from the doctors, and sometimes the doctors bring them in for briefings on the Hill that we're helping facilitate. And so it's a very symbiotic relationship, to say the least. But actually, one story, this is a fairly recent experience. I had a friend of mine on the Hill. She's not particularly religious, though she's broadly conservative, but not ultra conservative, I think. And she called me and said, my friend is struggling with questions about her fertility. She just went to a fertility clinic, had a terrible experience, and just wants to talk to someone. Would you be okay talking to her? And I was like, sure. And so we got on the
Mm.
call. And I, of course, right off the bat was like, I'm not a medical professional. This is not medical advice, but I am here to just talk with you about the issue. And so this woman in her early mid 30s was talking about how she and her husband were starting to prepare to have children. They weren't diagnosed with infertility, but they were a little concerned. There were some issues that were not, just some issues, like they maybe weren't able to conceive as they had hoped. She wasn't really sure. So she had talked to her OBGYN about it, who had ordered very basic diagnostic tests and then just referred her to a fertility clinic. Well, they get to the fertility clinic, and it very quickly became apparent that that doctor was also not really devoted to conducting more tests and helping her understand her fertility. And about 20 minutes into the conversation, the doctor looked at she and her husband and said, well, your insurance covers egg freezing. So do you just want to start an egg freezing cycle? And that way you don't have to worry. And she and her husband were so horrified because they had gone into this appointment wanting someone to run tests and help them understand their reproductive health. And instead, were being sold a $15,000 procedure. And so she left and just said, what in the world is going on here? So I just sort of broke down fertility awareness-based methods, cycle tracking. Here are the different medical approaches. Here's doctors I would recommend reaching out to. And afterwards, her husband said, oh my goodness, that was more information that we got from this policy analyst than we had from the fertility clinic when we were trying to address our infertility. And it's funny and
Yeah.
also horrifying. Like, there's no world where that should be the case. And yet
Yes.
here we are.
100%. 100%. Yeah. And here you are, a 28-year-old policy analyst helping these people navigate something that we shouldn't have to be navigating in the first place. And so what I'd like you to do, Emma, is send me, when we're done here, I want you to send me the links to these various organizations and whatnot. We'll put it all in the show notes for you. Ruthie's, you'll be able to find all this stuff. If you're a doctor, if you're involved in the healthcare world, you might want to connect with some of these organizations and become an ally or get trained or anything like that, because this is a very important development that's happening here. I'm going to tell you a story now about my daughter when she was a student at Berkeley. She took a graduate level class in fertility, demography. She's a demographer. My daughter's a demographer. And so there she's a college senior, and she's in a graduate class, and the professor's a woman, and I think 6 out of the 7 graduate students were women. And somewhere in the course of this class on fertility, which is not a medical thing, but a statistical thing, the professor said, well, someday all of you will have infertility issues and you will be doing IVF. It's like, it was just, my daughter was horrified. It's like, It's just like it's considered a normal part of a professional woman's career life that sooner or later you're going to be in the infertility clinic. So let's talk for a minute, if we may, about some of the success rates and statistics and so on. A few weeks ago, I interviewed a donor conceived person named Catherine Francisco. And in the course of that conversation, we were going back and forth about the stats. And she's like, we were both very skeptical, about what we were hearing from the fertility industry, but neither of us could pull it up exactly what those numbers were. One of the things that has always concerned me, I've done a little bit of looking into it. There's so many ways you can report success rates. You can report it per cycle. You can report the number of pregnancies, but not the live birth. And, just a lot of nooks and crannies where people can be led along with incomplete information and led to think that this is all going to be good, and it's really not. What are some of the key statistics that people need to know as they go into this whole process of trying to figure out their fertility?
Yeah, and you're absolutely right that it has been more challenging than it should be to actually understand what the success rates are. And part of this is a structural issue. So in 1992, when they passed it's called the Clinic Success Rate and Certification Act, which requires certified fertility clinics in the United States to submit their pregnancy and live birth outcomes along with the cycle attempts and some very basic demographic birth health outcomes. So is the baby born with cleft palate, yes or no? Is the woman using her own eggs or donor eggs? Things like that, but it's very basic. And when it was enacted, there was actually no clear enforcement mechanism put in place, meaning that fertility clinics, if they don't submit numbers, or if the numbers are found to be inaccurate or in error in some way, the CDC actually has no real enforcement mechanism to make them shape up and change course. They can get a slap on the wrist, they go on a naughty list, but nothing effectively changes. And even what's required is just basic cycle to pregnancy to live birth, which actually isn't telling you anything about how many human embryos are being created. And if you believe
Mm-hmm.
likelihood of conception, then how many human embryos are created is actually crucial, because we're talking about
Yeah,
how many human lives are created and lost or born through IVF. And so
right.
the CDC will release success rate outcomes every couple of years, though they're pretty far behind. I think the most recent year is 2022. And then the Society for Assisted Reproductive Technology, or SART, will also release success rate outcomes for the clinics in their network, but it's not comprehensive reporting. And so what we have found is that on the whole, if you take all age demographics together, IVF has a success rate between about 25% and 35% per cycle. And it has a cumulative success rate, so taking multiple cycles, of 60 or so percent. But it really just depends on how many cycles you do. And so some studies
Mm-hmm.
that have come out have shown that you need on average 2.5 IVF cycles to achieve a live birth of a child, which by the way is like 60 plus $1,000 to do 2.5 cycles. Um,
Yeah,
and if you're looking, of course, at ages, younger women are going to have much higher success rates. Women who are 40 and older, their success rates are 12% or less per cycle.
yeah,
Once a woman reaches the age of 43, her success rate is lower than 5% per
yeah.
cycle. And these are not numbers that I think a lot of women know about when they think about delaying their fertility. Because as you said in the story with your daughter, they're just told, well, you're going to do IVF and that's how you have babies. So it's fine if you delay your fertility till you're 38, 39, 40. But it turns out that even if you're relying on IVF and egg freezing, the likelihood that that will succeed is still very low, right? And not
Right.
reliable, right? You wouldn't want to put all of your childbearing hopes on success rate outcomes that are that low or unreliable. And then counter to that, likewise, if you're looking at restorative reproductive medicine, and I'm happy to send you these studies to even link to in the show notes, what has been so fascinating is that success rate outcomes for people who are practicing restorative reproductive medicine are comparable to, if not higher than, IVF success rates. Now, of course, RRM is not judged on a per cycle basis. It's judged on
Right.
a cumulative basis of 12 months to 24 months. So some studies are 12 months, some studies are 24 months, but you're saying over the course of treatment that's offered, what are their success rates? And so ostensibly, someone could do multiple IVF cycles, someone could do RRM care, and the success rate outcomes are about the same, if not higher, for RRM. And what's really interesting is there was one study done in 2018 working with families that had previously done IVF, anywhere between 1 and 9 cycles of IVF, and had failed to achieve a live birth. And then after undergoing RRM care, the overall cohort had a 32% live birth rate. So IVF had failed up to 9 times for a family, but after restorative care, the overall percentage was 30%. But for younger women, it was even higher. And so
Sure.
some very large cohort studies have found success rates in the 60 to 80 percentile, like very high, very promising. And so even though they are assessed differently because of the different standard of care that is implemented, it is completely false to say that RRM is, quote, just delayed care or RRM doesn't work. Because of all the studies that have been done, it's very clear it is a good alternative to or even a better option than what IVF can offer.
Yes, and I think it was you who pointed this out in one of your interviews or one of your articles or something, that if you correct the underlying condition, it's corrected forever. You don't have to go back and do another cycle to have another baby. You're, in fact, my friend Katie Francisco is on her fourth baby now.
Yes.
And she this came up, this is so interesting, her story is so interesting because she herself was a child of donor conception, and then she had infertility issues in her marriage, and it was restorative reproductive medicine that helped her, because there was no way she was going down the artificial path. She already knew better than that. So now, you know what, we're going to talk later in the show, we're going to be talking about the policies and the new laws and things like that, because that's very interesting and very encouraging. um, but I would like you to say just a little bit about, just spell it out. I think our readers, our listeners, followers can figure it out. Who benefits from keeping people in the dark about restorative medicine? Just
Yeah.
spell it out for us, can you,
Well,
Emma?
this is actually a point that Madeline Kearns at the Free Press made just this week in writing yet another essay about how restorative reproductive medicine helped her overcome her infertility. And she's now pregnant with her second child because of this. And she correctly noted that the most vocal opponents of restorative reproductive medicine are IVF doctors and the fertility industry, who stand to lose the most money. Because it turns out if your patients aren't just coming to you for IVF as a first response to a diagnosis of infertility, and they're actually treating and healing the underlying causes such that they don't need IVF, it's those clinics in the fertility industry that are losing the most money and currently are making the most money with our IVF first model that's in place. And what's even more concerning is that if you look at the makeup of the fertility industry, a majority of fertility clinics, especially in urban high population areas, are actually owned by private equity firms. And this is not just a Heritage Foundation talking point, this is well established across the medical literature. Well, what do private equity firms do? Private equity firms look for high turnaround investments that will make them a lot of money over a short amount of time, meaning that it is in the best interest of the owners of these clinics to push more IVF and more add ons for the IVF process that'll make them more money, even when studies find that those additional add ons actually don't improve success rate outcomes. They just charge people more money. And so that's
Hmm.
like pre-implantation genetic testing of human embryos, which eugenically grades and selects human embryos based on their health or sex or even potential looks. And that's already being done in about 40% of all IVF cycles. But at private equity owned firms, it's done way more. And so it's a very obvious example of IVF is a business model meant to have high profit turnaround in a short amount of time by pushing these very invasive, very costly procedures on grieving families who really just want a baby. and want someone
Right.
to help them
Right.
do that. And
Right.
yeah, and so yeah, I mean that's just like the unfortunate but like very harsh truth about it.
Yes, and it's interesting to me because I'm a lifelong free market economist person, okay? And so when I was your age, the big issue was the Cold War and communism in the Soviet Union, and communism can't work, and we still know communism can't work, but people still need to keep learning it. You would think that left-wing people would be grossed out and up in arms about an industry making money off of people's infertility in the very harsh ways that you're talking about. And also, you would think that I find it, you know, it makes me smile about myself, that as a conservative woman, I'm like, I'm not happy with this particular free market thing that's going on here. I am not happy about it at all.
But you
So it's
know,
a very interesting reversal, don't you
yes,
think?
but it's something I was actually just talking to someone about this today because it's actually a little bit different because the IVF industry has had such a monopoly on the entire fertility industry that there's
Yeah,
actually no free market competition taking place. And
yeah,
so if this is a thriving and healthy market, they would be forced to update their protocols and adjust to meet patient demand and to meet the most recent research around the best practices in treating infertility. But the reality is they actually haven't done that and they haven't been forced to because they function as a monopoly in our fertility care
yeah,
system.
yeah,
And so it's
yeah,
actually it's incredibly problematic. And notably, in the last 2 years, since restorative reproductive medicine has entered the political scene and become a worthy opponent of our standard
yes.
IVF care, to put it lightly, the fertility organizations have completely lost their mind, where they spend so much time and money and advocacy resources. They have sent letters to every governor in the United States. They've published multiple press releases, public statements, research articles. They will like just I mean like aggressively approach lawmakers advocating for IVF against restorative reproductive medicine. And what do they
Yeah,
say? This is not me making it up. They will both say, like in the same paragraph, that restorative reproductive medicine is just ideological care. And at the same time, we already offer restorative reproductive medicine, so we don't need more of this. We're already doing diagnostic care.
right,
And so
right,
you sit
right,
there and
right.
you're like, well, actually, both of those can't be true. Either it's, quote, just ideology, or you already offer it and it's good medicine, but you can't have it both ways. And it turns out that
Yeah,
restorative reproductive medicine is neither of those. It's not an ideology, it's actually true root cause care for infertility. And fertility clinics are not offering that level of diagnostic care. And this you'll find fascinating because on Monday, a preprint study came out actually making that exact point. So, a health insurance actuarial firm reviewed patient data claims over a 4 year time span, looking at 5 million patient data claims for couples who were dealing with infertility. And what they found is that when a couple is diagnosed with infertility and begins their infertility journey, there are very basic recommended diagnostic workups that the American Society for Reproductive Medicine recommends that their clinicians do before moving on to IVF. They found that over 9 months, 70 to 85% of couples had started IVF, and yet between 13% and 78% had not received the basic diagnostic workups that they were supposed to do, which means the fertility industry was not doing the diagnostic care that they say that they do, which is already less than what restorative reproductive medicine does, mind you, but like even the basic diagnostic workups, but were pushing people along to IVF at very high rates.
yes, yes. And so the significance of RRM coming onto the scene in the way that it has, it means that things are going to change in the insurance market because the insurance is a big part of what's driving this, and in federal regulation. And we're going to talk about that a little later, a little bit of the policy details. But the reason this market isn't exactly free is in fact partly ideological. There are people who don't, who want certain things and don't want other things, but there people are making a lot of money under the setup that is now standard, and that's partly driven by insurance regulations and in partly driven by other forms of public policy. So that's all part of the mix here.
Right.
That and bringing on the restorative stuff is a very important development, and I'm delighted. I can't tell you how happy I am to see the Heritage Foundation leading the charge on this thing. I've been around social conservative circles for 25 years or thereabouts, and back in the day, Heritage was not involved in social issues very much, and now they are leading the charge, and it's such a great thing, such a fine development. So I really appreciate that. But I would like to, because I am old, I would like to look back at how this whole thing fits into the larger picture of the sexual revolution, because the ideological aspect of it is kind of under the surface all the time. And so I want to draw a few things out for you, and see what you think of it. Um, our culture is pretty much all in for the idea of separating sex and babies. And I remember back in the day when I first figured out that we'd all been bamboozled, and I started lecturing about this. I said, we all thought it was going to be fun to have sex without babies. Well, now we're having babies without sex, which I'm pretty sure is not as fun as the old-fashioned way. And that would get a laugh, and 20 years ago that was funny and everything, But it's germane. It's germane to what we're dealing with. Can you comment on that? Just help people pull the ideological pieces together, Emma.
Oh yeah, no, this is such a good point. And I'm actually publishing my second book called Rethinking Fertility. I'm writing it right now. It'll come out in a year or two, but it's based on this package deal of marriage, sex, and children, and what happens when our culture and our medical systems sever marriage from sex and sex from children at a fundamental level. And so, something that I actually did a deep dive in a few years ago, and I published this with Notre Dame as a research paper with them, was looking at the ways that the women's health movement fractured over the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. And so you had this era of the sexual revolution and recentering female sexuality in the conversation. And all of a sudden, with really Roe v. Wade and the mass adoption of birth control, a massive divide. And so one direction went those in the women's health movement that have really promoted midwifery and natural approaches to fertility and sort of the holistic earthy side, maybe like what's the Maha movement today, right? So you had a section of the women's health movement go that direction, and in many cases achieve very good things for women, really recentering home birth and childbirth as a natural experience of the body, things in that space. But at the same time, the dominant group in women's health really embraced this trifecta of abortion, birth control, and IVF. And so
Yeah.
abortion, of course, became an erroneous constitutional right under Roe v. Wade in 1973. But crucially, in 1973, that's also the year that birth control hit 10 million users in the United States and was mass consumed as a way of controlling or limiting one's fertility. A couple of years after that, IVF was introduced on the scene. But instead of actually training and empowering women to understand how their bodies work and then honor their bodies and the body of their unborn child, we instead embrace this approach that is simply destructive, suppressive, or circumventive to a woman's natural fertility. And this is really where things I think have gone awry, and which is in part why our approach to women's health is so outdated in the United States. Because I mean,
Yes.
think about it
Yes.
this way, like a woman suffers a medical complication, and instead of the doctor saying, well, let's research this, let's take all of the medical and scientific and technological advancements available to us, which are immense, praise God, and use it to actually heal your body, preserve the life of your baby, empower you with knowledge, they say, well, let's just get an abortion and try again. Like that's actually a very outdated approach to medicine because it's not
Right.
accessing all of this great research. And same for infertility. Instead of actually taking everything we've learned about the man and woman's body and crafting a personalized precision plan to treating their infertility by actually treating the underlying causes, we say, well, who really cares what's causing infertility? Here's IVF. I hope it works for you.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
And I want to go back to the split that you described in the women's movement, because in my book, The Sexual State, which is sitting up here, I have a whole section on what I call the contraceptive ideology, which is the idea of separating sex from babies. And, the society is all in on that, that these are, and you can see it in so many different ways. But one of the very interesting things that happened at this juncture, there was a, there were hearings about the pill and the dangers of the pill to women. And there was a book called The Doctor's Case Against the Pill. And the organization founded around that no longer, they're still around, but they don't talk about contraception. So it's kind of odd what happened. But a factor that you haven't mentioned yet, but I'm sure you'll see the point of it, is that it's around this time that there are a bunch of people who are saying there are too many people in the world, too many people in the world, population control. We're all going to die if we don't get rid of all these people. Billions of dollars were spent by a handful of very rich people who thought there were too many people in the world. And that money, I think you cannot underestimate the importance of that money and how it steered the whole thing. Because some people were allowed to be called feminists and some people were not allowed to be called feminists. I mean, it just steered that whole conversation in what I think is a really just, you know, it's part of why we are where we are today, for
Oh,
sure.
100%. Yes. I mean, that was not cited directly in the Roe v. Wade decision, but the population bomb came out just a few years before Roe v. Wade was decided. The
Yeah.
entire cultural mindset was that we're overproducing, we need fewer babies. And it turns out that then inserting a technological workaround, IVF, later on, also isn't sufficient. And so this is the other side of the conversation where, like, now today, 2020 onwards, people are more aware that we're actually in a bit of a demographic crisis where we're having fewer
Yes.
and fewer children every year. Because it turns out their
Yes.
efforts were really successful starting in the 1970s onwards. And so then people say, well, to solve our demographic crisis of not having enough babies, we need more IVF. And so you have countries
Right.
like Hungary and China and Israel pledging billions of dollars or investing billions of dollars to build more IVF clinics to increase the birth rate. But the problem, and this is a study done by Lyman Stone at the Institute for Family Studies, looking at state level data and corporate level data in the United States. And he has some country comparisons as well, but it was fine. It was primarily focused in the United States. When there is an IVF mandate or large IVF subsidy enacted, it actually doesn't change the overall birth rate. But what it does affect is who has babies and when.
And
So
when.
we found
Yep.
that younger women were slightly less likely to have children. Older women were slightly more likely to have children. And in one study, and there's been studies in Israel that have also shown this, they were actually more likely to delay marriage and take longer to
Hmm.
get married. And of course, the crucial factor here is that a woman who starts having kids when she's 28 can naturally have a lot more kids than if you start having kids when you're 40 years old, in which case you're lucky if you have one or two children. And so
Right.
overall, you're actually suppressing the birth rate generation after generation.
Yeah, and you and I could figure that out in about 30 seconds. You don't need an elaborate study to help you figure that out. And I want to just mention here, again, this is something I put in the sexual state. John D. Rockefeller III was one of the first big money guys to say there's too many people in the world. And for a long time, Emma, people thought he was kind of creepy when he was talking about population control. And he did stuff like, I mean, he was in the background of the sterilization clinics in India and things like that. But around 1974, he figured out that if you start talking about women's empowerment and women's education, that he could get 90% of what he wanted and sound like a nice guy instead of sounding like a creep. And so if you can tell women, delay, 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 it's good for you. We love you. We're doing this because we love you. This is good for you. If you do that, you can reduce the birth rate. If you can delay age at first marriage, and that's exactly what they did. And so that's why the result of this study about IVF, it makes complete sense. You haven't changed the underlying cultural message to say babies are a blessing. Let's get on with it. Nobody's talking like that except us over here at the Ruth Institute and probably some of you whack jobs at Heritage. Babies are a blessing. Let's get on with it. And still there's this whole, we've mechanized ourselves, our way of thinking about it, and IVF plays right into that. Let's control the environment. Let's control. Whereas, the old fashioned way is just let her rip. Whip it on me, Lord. How many you got for me? Let's go with this. So anyway, the next thing that I want to talk with you about a little bit, we haven't explored this very much, but I think you'll see the point of it. The contraceptive ideology separates sex from babies. What I call the divorce ideology separates both sex and babies from marriage. And implicit in that idea is the idea that kids don't really need their parents that much. And so if you switch out partners and things like that, it'll be fine. Kids will be fine. The, the bond between parent and child is diminished and redefined somehow. And so when we're doing the artificial things, we're separating the creation of the child from the act of love between the mother and the father, right? So I'd like your thoughts about that, Emma. How do you? I mean, I know what I think, and my Ruth followers probably know what I think. We want to hear. Have you thought through, some of the kind of further implications for the bonds between mother and father and between mother, father, and baby?
Yeah, and you mean specifically when using reproductive technology? Is that the framing?
It, yes, the way in which we've the God's design built into our bodies is that every human being should come into existence as an act of love, the love between the mother and the father. God's participation in every creation and every creative act is love. God loves every single person who's ever been created. That's how it works. That's where we all come from. But He has designed the world so that we participate in that. And so when you take that out of the equation, we can do this any old way we want. And of course, we've been doing all sorts of things in the backseat of cars and things like that we shouldn't be doing. But we've taken it kind of to a new level when we're doing it in the hospital with strangers. And well, Catherine Francisco said it to me when the donor conceived person. She said, I hate thinking about my conception. I hate thinking about it. It started with pornography and masturbation. I hate it.
Yeah.
So talk us through this a little bit more. I know they're not talking about this on Capitol Hill probably, but our people need to be coached into thinking this through. Help us out.
Yeah, the first thing that comes to mind here is that with the genesis of IVF, it opened the door for up to 6 potential parents being at play in the conception of a child. And so, if you break it down, including surrogacy, it means that there's no longer a unified whole between marriage, sex, and children, or a unified whole between sex, biological parenthood, gestational parenthood, and the intended parent who will raise the child. So, what IVF enables is you can have 2 intended parents who will raise the child, but may or may not have had anything to do with the conception of the child. Then you have the egg donor and the sperm donor, and you could buy that on the market, or you could use the married couple's own egg and sperm. Then you have in surrogacy the gestational carrier, the woman who uses her womb to bring that child into the world. And then, of course, you have the IVF doctor who, in the clinical setting, is actually creating the human embryos in a petri dish in a laboratory rather than allowing that conception to occur naturally within the body. And so the result is that children could be born with 5 or 6 different adults responsible for their
Yeah.
creation, conception, birth, and actual raising of the child in a way that certainly adds a high level of confusion and heartache and identity crisis in the conversation that otherwise doesn't need to be there or isn't beneficial to the child to have it there. And I think that also the technologies that we engage in do shape and change the way that we think about the world, about what it means to be a parent or a child. And so this is something that Marshall McLuhan, who coined the term "the medium is the message" in the
Yeah.
1960s, he has written a lot about this by talking about the ways that we shouldn't judge a technology simply based on what it technically does. So IVF takes egg and sperm and creates human embryos in a lab. That's the technical definition, but IVF is so much more than that. And he says you should actually judge a technology based on the social and psychic consequences that it bears on society. meaning that with the introduction of IVF, it didn't just enable us to create and implant human embryos, it actually radically upended our entire understanding of what it means to be a mom and a dad and the
Yep.
relationship between parents and children by enabling same sex couples to become, quote, parents, or through IVF and donor conception, or through allowing very old people to use a surrogate to have a baby, even if they're a single man in their 60s or whatever the case may be. And unlike adoption, which is an act of charity toward a child who suffered an immense tragedy, cannot be raised by their parents, and is now, out of an act of charity, being given the opportunity to have a family, the use of our reproductive technologies is oftentimes intentionally creating that tragedy in the pursuit of having a child. And so I think there's just, it just has radically changed. And it changes it too, because IVF gives us this false belief that we can somehow control our fertility and control what kind of children we have. So, notably,
Yeah.
when IVF was created, it was responding to two very narrowly tailored cases of women who were undergoing chemotherapy and losing access to their eggs, and women who had blocked fallopian tubes, which quite literally prohibited conception from taking place. Today, we actually have fairly successful, highly reliable procedures that can unblock fallopian tubes and enable natural conception. And there's a host of far less ethically complicated approaches you can take, even in cases of chemotherapy and cancer treatments. And so rather than IVF being this very limited, narrowly tailored treatment for these extreme cases, IVF has now become a way for anyone for any reason to have a baby if they have enough money. And so it's not surprising that in recent years, we've seen the massive increase in these genetic testing firms that promise to test your human embryo created through IVF for over 2,000 potential traits and conditions. Tons of health issues, the sex of the baby, the eye color, the looks of the baby, and in some cases, even personality and IQ outcomes. Because IVF isn't just about helping you treat infertility, because it's not treating infertility at all, but it's giving you a sense of control over your fertility
Yes.
and over the kind of child you have. And so all of these other downstream bad fruit effects are naturally coming through that in a way that parents now don't think about children as a gift received, but rather an act of the will that they are conferring into the world by their own desire. And if they desire a certain kind of child, they can get it. And if they don't desire the kind of child they conceive, they can destroy it. But either way, that sort of relation of love that you described at the beginning has completely been lost in lieu of this control-oriented approach.
Yes, yes. We're doing consumer-based eugenics. Instead of eugenics where the government says, you're poor, you're stupid, we're going to sterilize you, even though you haven't committed you've never done anything wrong, but we're going to sterilize you. That's what the United people, different states did that in the 20s and 30s, people. Instead of that kind of eugenics, we're letting the consumers pick. They'll pick the best, they'll pick the nicest, they'll pick the healthiest. And so it really, I couldn't agree with you more that we really have changed in a fundamental way the relation between the parent and the child. Instead of the child being a gift received, the child is the parent's project somehow. And in there's a natural hierarchy in generations. When you're a baby, you're little and you're small and you're helpless. But your mom and dad were also once little and helpless and small. And what we're doing here is changing the power imbalance in a way that it can never, it doesn't cultivate empathy or sympathy with the other person. It's more, this is my product, and I'm not satisfied with the product. I'm going to take it back.
Right. Well,
How
and
how 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 how
so
can this
interesting.
how long can this go on? How far?
This is why I think that donor conceived children are already doing this, and I think children who are selected through these advanced embryonic genetic screening technologies are also going to be some of the biggest advocates in how we rethink fertility in the future,
Yeah.
because they are the embodiment of this broken relationship. So take, for example, Elon Musk. Elon Musk tragically lost his firstborn child to SIDS, or sudden infant death syndrome, when the child was only a couple of months old. And by all accounts that I've read, this tragedy really affected Elon Musk and affected the way he thought about having children. Because after that naturally conceived child passed away unexpectedly, almost every single one of the subsequent 13 or 14 children he has was conceived through IVF. Most were genetically tested, and some had the use of
Yeah.
a surrogate. And it seems like a prime example of attempting to control the natural vulnerabilities of being human, of childbirth, of loss with these technological interventions. And so Elon Musk's oldest living child, who now identifies as Vivian, is actually one of the most interesting counter examples, because Elon Musk has blamed the woke mind virus of transgender ideology for taking his son into a man who now identifies as a woman. But if you talk to the son who now identifies as Vivian, he gives a very different answer. And so he has this thread that I've quoted in a few pieces where he says, at my birth, or like when I was an embryo, basically, my parents genetically screened and selected me to be a boy. And basically just calling out how incredibly messed up that commercialized selection is. And so he said, when I was born a boy, but then didn't feel like a boy, I was all of a sudden disappointing my parents and not living up to the product that they had ordered. And this is paraphrased, but he's wrestling with this
Wow.
idea of using
Yeah.
genetic selection in IVF, and how he as the child just never felt like he fulfilled the product his parents ordered, and that actually being a crucial breaking point in his alienation from his family. And there have been other articles done looking at this of like when children are genetically selected, it severely impacts and harms the relationship and how they think of themselves and even how their parents think of them, because there's cases where parents take this approach of genetic determinism, which is to say that genetics determine who you are and that nurture and nature have very little to do with it. And so or nurture has very little to do with it. And so then those parents actually take a hands-off approach where they say, well, we've already selected you for the best genetic outcomes. I don't have to be as involved because you will just genetically naturally develop into the right kind of person. And of course, anyone who's ever had a child and raised a child knows that that's complete folly, right? Your child
Right.
must be nurtured
Right.
and discipled and guided and formed into a robust human being, genetics completely aside, though they play into it. And so there's just this whole world that I think with the introduction of IVF and with these technologies just leads us to these very weird dystopian places.
Yes, I need to pause here and just absorb what you just said here. Hey, a quick shout out to our sponsor, realestateforlife.org. This is the most pro-life, pro-family way to buy or sell a home. Go to realestateforlife.org. You'll be connected with a Christian realtor. Part of their commission will go to the pro-family charity of your choice, the Ruth Institute, for example. And it costs you nothing at all. It's the most pro-life, pro-family way to buy or sell a home. Go to realestateforlife.org. So we're back from that little break, and it give me a chance to think about this kind of amazing thing that you've shared about Elon Musk's son. I knew a little bit about it, but I didn't know all of that information that you shared. One thing I've seen a number of people write about, Mary Eberstadt talks about this, the idea that the way in which the relations between parent and child have been downgraded, you could say, in modern times, it one of the things it means is the kids don't know who they are, and so they're vulnerable to identity politics in a new way. Like they're much more vulnerable. And it sounds like Elon Musk's son, who calls himself Vivian now, is it was very vulnerable, and the circumstances of his conception are not nothing. That is not an insignificant part of it. I know, I have another question. I didn't think of this before. um, are you aware of any studies that have looked carefully at donor conceived persons, IVF conceived persons, and specifically asked about the children conceived in surrogacy or carried in surrogacy? They've looked at outcomes for the kids. Because in my mind, the scenario that you painted a few minutes ago, that a person could have multiple parents, that you've separated the genetic from the gestational, from the social, etc. um, breaking down motherhood, for example, into all these multiple components, what impact does that have on the child? We hope it doesn't matter, but we don't really know. Do we? Do we have studies about this?
The best we can say is that we don't fully know what the impact is, but we do have studies that have been done that show that actually these technologies bear a detrimental impact on child well-being. So particularly in the donor conceived world, there have been a handful of studies done in recent years to show that donor conceived children struggle with much higher rates of depression and anxiety, identity crisis. Who are they? Who am I? Where do I come from?
Yeah,
And
yeah.
also impacts on their overall behavior and academic well-being. In the world of surrogacy, this is a really interesting area because there has only been one longitudinal study done in the United Kingdom assessing the psychological well-being of children created through surrogacy. One study. And that study itself, it was looking at child well-being at ages 1, 2, 3, 4, 7, 10, and 14. And so the adolescent years of a child's life. At the beginning of the study, there were only 42 children involved. By age 14, there were only 28 children involved. So you're looking at a study with a very, very small population size and
Hmm, hmm.
a study that largely relies on the parent's perception of child well-being.
Oh,
Because a
oh.
1-year old can't articulate to you how they're doing. They don't even necessarily have the
Right,
language. And a parent who is being asked, is your surrogate born child that you intentionally brought into the world through surrogacy doing okay? Parents are going to have the natural inclination to say yes, even if they
fine, they're
are.
fine.
Right. Even if there are maybe clear signs that they're not fine. And so that's the
Right,
one study that's been done. It has a host of methodological shortcomings or errors or like problems in it, right? Like it's a very small sample
right.
size. It relies on the parents. And at age 7 and 10, they actually did report worse outcomes for surrogate conceived children as they're sort of
Hmm.
wrestling with their identity and who's my parents and where did I come from. But what is so bizarre is that that study has been cited everywhere to justify the expansion of
Yeah,
surrogacy. So when the
yeah.
state of New York legalized commercial surrogacy in 2021, and they said, well, what's the psychological impact on children? And then they quoted this study and
They're
said, look, they're fine.
fine.
There are no
They're
problems here.
fine. Yeah.
So
Right, right,
28
right.
children have now have set state policies, regulations, and I did this paper for the Institute for Family Studies because people often say, oh no, there's lots of studies that have been done looking at child well-being and surrogacy. But every single time a study claims to assess the psychological well-being of a child created through surrogacy, when you actually read the study, it's not based on any new research. It's only pointing back to that one study done in the
Yes,
United
yes.
Kingdom.
Okay.
It's
Yeah.
just like
Okay.
so bizarre. Yeah.
Okay, and this is an extremely important point. That is exactly how they created the consensus that same-sex parenting was harmless. That's exactly the same technique. Teeny tiny samples, repeated again and again. Ask the moms, how are the kids doing? All of that. And it's really frustrating. We have just produced a video that's going into some of the same-sex parenting studies because people are making real decisions based on this stuff. And when you think about it, if you really think about it from the perspective of what do we know about what it means to be human, there shouldn't be a single study because there shouldn't be a single data point. We should have known better from the beginning, just like there shouldn't be people trying to change from a boy to a girl. That we shouldn't have to do a study about that. We just should not be experimenting on ourselves and our children in this manner. So I think I'd like to take a few minutes here. We've been talking for quite a little while. I want to make sure we do talk somewhat about the policy things that are going on, because a couple people reached out to us and we asked our people to write in about uh, there was you were part of this as well, the request for comments, search for public comments and that kind of thing. So we got to be involved in that a little bit. I want to point out one thing to our libertarian friends about the free market in this whole area, okay? Because the product And this is particularly germane when you've got donor conception involved, when you've got donor gametes involved, because the product that the industry is selling is a child that is genetically related to you or to one of the people in the relationship, a child to which you have undisputed parental rights. That is part of the package of what the people are buying. And so you cannot sell that product unless you have a legal structure that says the donor, the sperm donor, is a legal stranger to the child. He can't show up on your doorstep. The egg donor is a legal stranger to the child. If you buy genetic material, you can't turn around and go demand child support payments or anything like that. The law cuts off the contact between the genetic parent and the child. You can't have this market without the state. This is entirely the creation of the state. It wouldn't exist without that infrastructure around it. Never mind the incentives and taxes and insurance and all of that kind of stuff and the medical stuff. So with that thought in the back of our minds, because I know that's not on the table. I don't, nobody's talking about reform at that level, but you guys are working on some things. Tell people what's in the works
Yeah.
on this issue as far as the policy is concerned. Do you want to start with the federal or talk about the state, or how do you want to organize this? Because there's stuff going on at multiple levels.
Yeah, we'll start with the state level. And so yeah,
Okay,
and I think your point here at the beginning is so important because states have a crucial interest in the well-being and flourishing of children. And if you have a technology that is enabled by legal structures and health insurance structures and markets that actually is contrary to the well-being of its citizens and of children, then there is a vested interest in ensuring that we're actually putting the best interest of children first in our law, and not just letting the desires of adults, as Katie Faust often says, negotiate and determine what kind of care and technology is available. And crucially, it's not just even that's available, it's that's being pushed heavily on parents who are struggling with infertility. And I think
right.
that's what you can't forget is that this isn't just like, oh, you have all of these options on the table. We're not saying you shouldn't have options on the table. We're saying that parents are only being given one option, IVF, and
Yeah,
they're being told nothing else is available or works, which goes back to the anti market principles we're discussing. And so, on the state level, since we have started really back in 2024, when IVF became a national interest in the presidential election, President Trump, Kamala Harris, everyone was talking about IVF and really trying to position themselves as the pro IVF party. And we realized that even if we got all of the pro life protections in place for parents and human embryos in the course of IVF, that we would still be failing at the bigger question, which is how do you help couples who are struggling with infertility access the care that they need? And a big part of the access conversation is awareness about the technology to begin with. And so, very quickly, starting in 2025, Arkansas became the first state to enact something called the Restore Act. And so, the Restore Act is a bill that promotes root cause care for infertility, better access to the treatment through either Title 10 funding or health insurance coverage, better training for doctors, things in that space. And so it's promoting in all of the relevant areas access to root cause care for infertility treatments. Now, notably, Arkansas has had an IVF mandate in place since 1987. And so when Arkansas introduced, which is, I know, shocking, because there's such a
what,
rare.
no, but wait, just stop. Tell people, what is an IVF mandate?
Yes. Okay. So an IVF mandate is where the state actually mandates that health insurance companies must cover IVF as a part
Oh,
of health insurance care. So if a couple's diagnosed with infertility, they have a mandated right to health insurance covered IVF. Now,
I
in,
see.
in the case of Arkansas, that is only a very limited use of IVF. So I think it's like one cycle of IVF, which based on our earlier conversation won't necessarily be sufficient to have a child. But because an IVF mandate was already in place, when lawmakers in Arkansas were considering um, including root cause care for infertility in the conversation. They introduced it as a mandate for care. That's not a Heritage Foundation proposal, but it is how Arkansas implemented root cause care for infertility. So that was enacted in 2025, first state to actually put restorative reproductive medicine in state law. Since then, we've had multiple other states introduce legislation, either direct Restore Act legislation or other efforts to promote awareness or access to restorative reproductive medicine. And I think in 2027, we're going to see even more on this front, as states are frankly just very excited to have a more robust option available to treat the underlying causes of infertility. The second related area of policy action we're seeing on the state level is with strong reporting requirements for IVF and infertility, which is to say, we don't just want to track how many cycles you have, how many pregnancies or live births. We want to know every human embryo that you're creating, because ultimately we want to hold the fertility industry accountable for the creation of human life. And we have been very, I think, as Americans and particularly as Christians, very consistent in talking about the pro-life measures to protect unborn babies in the womb, but we have not consistently applied that life begins at conception to our practices in IVF clinics. And so we
Right.
need to get serious about actually tracking how many human embryos are being created and what's happening to them. How many are being destroyed and definitely frozen, used for research, or failing to implant. And so with the Restore Act and then with IVF reporting requirements, those are the primary two state level efforts that we are working on and that we're seeing really encouraging headway in. The third and fourth in that is states are doing a lot right now to rethink their approach to commercial surrogacy. So, Florida just became the first state to actually prohibit international commercial surrogacy between foreign nationals and women in the United States. And this corresponds to a much bigger federal debate that's happening right now in the birthright citizenship world. But there,
Yeah. Oh,
Texas.
yeah.
Yeah, Texas is also now considering prohibiting international surrogacy. So a Chinese national can't fly to Texas to buy a baby from a commercial surrogate, which is common sense
And I
legislation.
got to stop you right there. I got to stop you right there and say this, everybody. I don't know if you all realize this. Chinese billionaires are using American surrogates. The babies are being born here. They will be American citizens. I want you to know part of the reason the Chinese are coming here, surrogacy is illegal in China. Okay. The Chinese communists don't allow this, but California allows it. Continue.
And
Sorry.
it encourages it.
I could not forbear but put that in there. Oh, God.
And it's a well documented
Ah,
massive problem. They're literally buying
yeah,
citizenship through babies. Like it's insane.
absolutely.
Yeah,
100%. Yeah,
it's just that's a whole we can do a whole other podcast just on that one topic. But we're
yeah,
seeing a lot of states rethink their surrogacy laws and protections
yeah.
around surrogacy. And then finally, Colorado in 2021 became the first and only state to actually prohibit anonymous egg and sperm donation. They did not prohibit all egg and sperm donation, but they did say that children have a right to know who their mother and father are, including in the course of IVF or purchasing egg and sperm. And frankly, with the rise in genetic consumer testing, such as Ancestry.com or 23andMe, there is no such thing as anonymous egg and sperm donation anymore because so many children and adults are finding out, oh, yeah, I
Yeah,
actually didn't come from my parents. I have 15 siblings over here I never knew about. Yeah. So
right.
on the state level, it's primarily promoting root cause care for infertility, reporting requirements around human embryos and IVF, restricting surrogacy to from international buyers, and then talking about donor conception on the state level. Those are the big four priorities for states.
Uh-huh.
And then on the federal level, very similarly, there's a lot of action around promoting root cause care for infertility and reproductive health conditions. So we've had a federal Restore Act introduced twice now in the Senate and the House. There have been a number of regulatory efforts to promote more research and understanding around endometriosis, hormonal imbalances, male factor infertility. Currently, the Trump administration, particularly through HHS, is doing a lot of really good work. They are reforming Title 10 to actually make Title 10 about empowering women to understand how their cycle works and naturally steward their fertility. shocking. They
Mm,
are
mm.
utilizing Title 10 to actually equip women to diagnose and understand reproductive problems and infertility before it becomes a massive issue later on. They're promoting body literacy, which is not sex education, right? It's not like very crass, here's how you have sex in a quote safe way, but they're actually saying, here's how your natural fertility works. Here's the 4 phases of your cycle. Here's what you need to know. Men, this is how male fertility naturally works. Here's when things are going wrong.
Yeah,
And then beyond that, they're introducing a host of grants to promote root cause care for infertility. And so there's a lot of new opportunities that have never existed before for doctors practicing in this space to actually do more research and get more support. And the two very crucial ones that I'll mention is that recently the Trump administration updated their language for the Embryo Adoption Awareness and Services Program, which is providing funding to clinics or organizations helping unwanted frozen embryos find a family where they can continue their life. And crucially, in that notice of funding opportunities, the Trump administration said, or the Trump administration recognized that these frozen embryos are human embryos in need of a family to continue their life, which is in effect saying that these are human embryos who are alive and need a family.
right,
Like adoption, that's a
right.
huge win. And then the second
Yes,
is this accepted fertility benefit that you mentioned at the beginning. And so when President Trump was on the campaign trail, many listeners may remember that he said, we're going to make IVF free. We're going to do an IVF mandate. Well, through a lot of hard work from a lot of very good people, we have shifted the conversation away from an IVF mandate to, frankly, an overwhelming support for root cause care for infertility. And so that resulted in the accepted fertility benefit, which is an optional, fully customizable fertility benefit that employers can offer if they want to. Think free markets, no mandates, much like a dental or vision benefit. So it's an add on to your health insurance, if you will. And the comment period just wrapped up on Monday. And based on our preliminary analysis, 75% of all comments were explicitly calling for root cause care for infertility through restorative
yes,
medicine. Only
y-
15% were calling for more IVF. And guess who were
yes.
submitting those? Mostly the fertility industry, who has a vested
Hmm.
financial interest. But it
Yeah,
turns out
yeah.
when you ask everyday Americans, what do you want from your fertility care? The overwhelming response from people submitting comments was that they wanted real root cause care for their infertility. And so that's going to go a long way in shaping the final product that the Trump administration offers.
Yes, and I want to thank all of the Ruth Institute followers who did send in comments because we asked our people to do that. We sent out a couple of emails and had it on our website and so on and so forth. And I know quite a few of our people did. And so I want all of you to be aware that it paid off. And that 75% number, we splashed that all over the place when we saw that. Because frankly, I was surprised that we were able to do that because usually we're playing catch up all the time and the guys with big bucks are dominating the field and all of that kind of thing. But the truth is, we do have numbers on our side. The ordinary people want ordinary, normal care, yeah, and ordinary people want to have babies the old-fashioned way, and most people see the point of it. Very few people actually are investors in infertility clinics. So it, it was very heartening to me to see that to see that outcome. So the vibe that I'm getting is that there are people inside the administration who are steering conversations into these directions in a way that just would have been unthinkable in 2024. Does that sound right?
Yes, this is absolutely right. And in large part due to just a massive increase in our knowledge and understanding of this issue. Not because there were
Hmm.
bad actors on one hand and now good actors on the other. I think like
Yeah.
most Americans, most people working in politics, most people in the administration had just never thought about what infertility actually is, and they didn't know
Right.
much about the fertility industry. They just thought pro-lifers support babies, IVF creates babies, IVF must be pro-life, we support this. And then
Right.
they learned
Right.
more and more and more and more, they realized, oh wait, this isn't what it's sold to be at all, and maybe there's actually a way better way to go about this. And I think that's
Yes.
really the progression we've seen over the last 2 years.
And if I'm not mistaken, straighten me out if this isn't right, but it was around that time that the ruling came down from the Alabama State Supreme Court saying that the parents whose babies were destroyed because somebody dropped a frozen vial, those parents could sue under a wrongful death claim. And whether they have done that successfully or not yet, I don't know. But when that happened, all of a sudden people are like, "Oh my gosh, these are living beings, and you can have a wrongful death claim," and people got hysterical. Oh, they're going to shut down the IVF clinics and so on and so forth. Is that am I correct about the
Yeah.
timing? Because
No,
if I
that's
am, yeah,
100%.
okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So around that time, I reached out to somebody from the National Catholic Bioethics Center. Perhaps you know those guys. If you don't, everyone should know about the National Catholic Bioethics Center. And I talked to one of their guys, John D. Camillo, about that case. And what we came up with in talking, just talking through the case. The reason everybody lost their mind over it is because it exposed the contradiction that's at the heart of the IVF industry. On one hand, they're selling a valuable product, which is a human being. If it wasn't a human being, no one would be interested in buying it. Okay. It's a human being. That's why that's their product and it's valuable. But they also want to treat it as medical waste when they got too many. And so the court's basically being asked to decide, is it medical waste or is it a human being? If it's medical waste, these bereaved parents have no recourse, people. If you're upset about them having recourse, they don't get anything? What, they get their storage fees back or something? What are we trying to say here? And so that contradiction is really at the heart of the IVF industry. That's what I think we have to stay focused on. That's what's wrong with it. At the heart of it, that's what's wrong. That's why it can't be pro-life. That's why it can't be regulated into something good. I'm on the record, Emma. You don't have to agree with this, and I'm not going to put you on the spot if you don't want to answer this. But I'm on the record as saying there are not enough regulatory band-aids that can fix this thing. It's got to be shut down completely. That's my position. That's the Ruth Institute's position.
Yeah. Well,
Um,
and I think this is something one of our vice presidents at Heritage actually used this a very similar analogy where he likened the fertility industry to a hamburger test. So if you're at a restaurant, you order a hamburger and the server comes by and knocks the hamburger off the table, it falls on the ground. Well, if she just looks at you and is like, "Oh, my bad, let me go get you another hamburger." And like, that's fine. It's another hamburger. There's no difference. You're totally set. If the human embryo is just like the hamburger, just something that you order, it's not, there's nothing unique about it, and you can just get another if it's destroyed, well, then it's not a person. But no sane person would hear that a human embryo is knocked off a table and destroyed and just think, oh, no big deal, we'll just get another, because it turns out that those parents actually view that human embryo rightly as their child, whether or not they're pro-life or not. They recognize that
right,
that human embryo is something unique and distinct, genetically complete, and is their child in a very real way. And you can't just say, "Oops, mea culpa, let me give you your storage fees back," right? There's something that has been lost that cannot be restored. And what's
right.
so tragic is that you're right that the IVF ruling kicked off this entire movement. We would not be talking
Yes,
about IVF and restorative reproductive medicine like we are right now if it weren't for that ruling. But the thing that's so heartbreaking is at the time, the president, key lawmakers in Alabama put a ton of pressure on Alabama to, quote, fix the problem, because they bought
hmm,
the lie that this ruling was somehow limiting or shutting down IVF. And it wasn't. Fertility clinics chose to shut down, and maybe that's because their protocols were not very good and they were afraid to be held to a higher standard. I don't know. But
right.
now Alabama has actually passed the worst law out of any states, because they
Wow,
give complete civil and criminal immunity to any IVF clinic in the course of IVF.
wow,
That if you
wow.
had another scenario where a fertility clinic left a door unlocked, allowed a mentally unwell person to come in, destroy human embryos, like clearly this is the fault of the fertility clinic. It's unclear whether parents would be able to sue, because clinics now receive immunity, even when the fault is fully theirs. And so
Yeah.
now Alabama is actually in a worse position than they ever were in. And who's paying the price? Well, it's ultimately the parents and the human embryos who pay the price, because the law was written just to protect the fertility industry from any wrongdoing they may do.
Wow. Wow, that's really something. I want to take a minute too to give a shout out to my friends at the Shiloh IVF ministry. I don't know if you've heard of these people, who really help people deal with the trauma of realizing that they have babies, they have children in frozen storage and trying to work out what to do with them. So if you're in this situation and you're having regret there, I know I've had people talk to me that are in agony. They've never had a moment's peace since they did it. um, Reach out to our friends at Shiloh IVF. We have a couple of other ministries listed there. We have some other people that help people with infertility, in these kinds of ways, and also the National Catholic Bioethics Center. You can call them and they'll help walk you through whatever your situation might be. And we'll put links to that in the show notes, and links to the interviews that we've had with these people, because I think a lot of people, if you've come this far and listened to this much of the show, you're going to be interested in what some of these other players have to say. But it's very encouraging to hear that people are rethinking the whole approach to dealing with infertility, because that's what needed to happen a long time ago. That needed to happen. It's way past time uh, for this to happen. Um, we got a question. We got a question from one of our viewers who had with this question, and I don't know whether you want to answer this on the air or not. I sent this to you ahead of time, and I don't know if you've thought about it. Um, One of our viewers wants to know from you, what are your thoughts on couples who use IVF, where the man has a condition like cystic fibrosis? He makes sperm, but they cannot leave the body in the normal way. There's no sperm or egg donation involved in this. Emma, do you have any thoughts about that personally, or
Yeah.
policy thoughts about that?
Yeah, and I think this is something I've written about, which is even thinking about the course of assisted reproductive technologies on a gradation. So we know that the vast majority of ART procedures done are traditional IVF, but IVF is not the only option if you are in a rare situation where you are struggling to literally get the sperm where it needs to be. We'll say it that way. And so, one of the things that I have often thought about in this space is that if you're in one of those very rare situations where that's the concern with cystic fibrosis or another condition, then you can actually rely on something called GIFT, or gamete intrafallopian transfer. Now, religiously, if you're Catholic, this may still be beyond the grounds of what you want to pursue, but I know other Christians like Mike Pence, our former vice president, who relied on GIFT in their own infertility journey. And so, what GIFT does is you extract the egg and sperm from a man and woman's body, but you don't create any human embryos outside the body. So, doctors will take a long catheter, they'll insert the egg, an air bubble, and then the sperm, and then insert it inside the woman's body. And so, then if natural conception occurs, it only occurs on a single embryo basis within the body. So there is an intervention in moving the sperm and egg into an optimal position, but there's no artificial creation of human life. It is still, in some ways, supplementing the process, if you will. And that approach is, I think, ethically and morally speaking, on completely different grounds than something like traditional IVF. And is something that I know a lot of Christians have considered when they have these very rare instances of needing some supplemental support and getting everything where it needs to be. We'll put it that way. And so I think that's one thing that couples could consider and keep in mind, that's very different than standard IVF. And again, I'm not saying that this is what one should do. That's your own moral and ethical and religious assessment, but it's far more within the bounds of supplemental care than just relying on something like IVF, where you're creating human embryos outside the womb, putting them in a less optimal position, and subjecting them to all of the other concerns or ethical compromises that we've talked about.
Mhm. Well, I appreciate you giving that answer, that you've explained what it is, and then people can evaluate it, with taking into account all of the things. And I assume you're not speaking for the Heritage Foundation,
This is
in
just
this
a
instance
personal
as well.
reflection of, like, these are options that are on the table. Right.
Yes,
Yes.
yes, I understand that, and I am Roman Catholic, and you're evangelical, and so there's probably some spaces where we're going to be different, and I am on the record as saying the whole thing should be shut down. I've already said that. There's one thing we haven't said that I do think needs to be said, um, and that is the question of having a right to a child.
Mhm.
And we need to say that when a child is born, yes, somebody has parental rights to that child. That's true. That's one way of using the term a right to a child. And traditionally, it's been the biological mother, the biological father, with very little ambiguity. If for some reason they're not available, we had some procedures that were a backup plan, a procedure for removing the parental rights from those people and then assigning it to somebody else through adoption. Pretty clear about who has parental rights understood in that way. But there's another way of talking about a right to a child, which is, do I have a right to have a child? Who has a right to have a child that doesn't currently exist? And
Right.
the answer to that question that I discovered after through experiencing 4 years of infertility, the correct answer, not the answer I like necessarily, but the correct answer is no one.
Yeah.
No one has a right to a child.
Yeah.
A child is not an object to which people have rights. A child is a person with rights of their own that need to be protected. That was not easy for me to hear,
Yeah.
but it was important that I see that. And then when I became a mother through adoption and through a miracle birth, that wasn't supposed to happen, then I respected it and appreciated it all the more because I could see it's a gift, and that's what you're supposed to feel.
Right. Oh,
It's
and
not
this,
an entitlement; it's a
yes.
gift.
Yes, and this is precisely it, right? It is good to desire good gifts, right? The desire for children is something that comes from God Himself. And yet, to your point, when you desire a gift, you don't get to demand what the gift is, when you receive it, or even if you receive it, because the nature of a gift
Right,
is something freely given outside of any sort of obligation from giver to receiver. And I think your point is so spot on that if we forget that, if we think of children as anything less than the gift it is, then we automatically shift to the space where we do believe that there is a right to a child, and then therefore a right to use any means necessary to create that child,
right,
even when
right,
that actually results in the destruction or dehumanization of countless children in the process. And I think this
yeah,
is one of the hardest pills for our modern world to swallow, that you somehow don't have a right to a child and you don't have a right to any means to create a child, right? And that there may be times when the answer is no, or not yet, or not in the way that you expected. And
right, right.
the grief and mourning in that, like there's space, so much space for that in the Christian faith and in the process, but it doesn't change the reality, right, of a child being a gift, not an obligation that you can just demand.
Right, right. Emma Waters, this has been extremely productive, fruitful conversation. Is there anything I haven't asked yet? Is there anything else you'd like to share with the audience?
I mean, there are a million things we could keep talking about in this space, but I think the main takeaways is that there is a serious revolution happening in the United States of men and women rethinking their fertility. These are not woohoo individuals who are believing fake science, but this is actually a serious move towards more advanced personalized medicine that truly treats the root causes of infertility. The studies prove that it works. The public support shows that people want it. And really, the question before us is, are we going to embrace truly innovative, life affirming, and restorative care? Or are we going to rely on an outdated model of IVF that actually fails on all of the most important fronts while dehumanizing and harming high levels of human life in the process? And that really is the question before us. But as you said, and thank you to all the roofies out there, like we are gaining so much ground right now in a way that is so encouraging and is so unlike the last 25 years of bioethics debates, that we shouldn't become distracted, but should be encouraged that we are gaining a lot of really good ground to protect life in this space.
Yes, and it's very important that the pro-life movement take this on and understand the importance of it. And I would just like to put in a pitch as a Roman Catholic to say our guys were on this a long time ago. Cardinal Ratzinger issued a document in 1987 William Leveda, Cardinal William Leveda, Cardinal Ratzinger. William Leveda in 2008 issued another document out of the Vatican, just going through the moral ethics of the whole thing. And they covered many of the points that we've talked about here, but they were ahead of the curve, And so if you're interested in it at that level, that material is available to you too. We'll put that in the notes. But this show is going to have a lot of notes, people, because we got a lot of information for you here. And I want you to be sure, Emma, to give everybody your website, or how can people follow you and keep track of what's going on in this world?
Of course. Okay, so I have a Substack called Rethinking Fertility and recently launched a podcast also called Rethinking Fertility that you should subscribe and follow. You can follow all of my work with the Heritage Foundation, be it policy or cultural commentary, just the Heritage Foundation, Emma Waters. But I also have a resource website called rethinkingfertility.com where we dive into a lot of the more specific questions around faith and ethics and approaches families can take when wrestling with these very difficult questions of infertility. And you can find me on social media. I'm on X at EML Waters and on Instagram at EML Waters _. But not only did I publish my first book this spring called Lead Like JL, but I have a second book coming out called Rethinking Fertility, where we dive into the package deal of marriage, sex, and procreation and really apply this unified whole model of what it means to be a parent and what it means to be human to the issue of infertility and reproductive technology. So stay tuned, because if you enjoyed this conversation, then hopefully you'll really love this book when it comes out.
I'm looking forward to this book when it's coming out. I hope you better send it to me.
Yes,
I expect a free author review copy from that.
absolutely.
That'll be great. Yeah, I subscribe to your Substack, and I'm really getting a lot out of it. And I just think everybody who cares about these issues should be following Mrs. Emma Waters of the Heritage Foundation. Thanks so much for being my guest on today's episode of the Dr. J Show.
Of course. Thanks for having me.